Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Julie Leach, and I manage campaigns and communications at TAF. I'm glad to welcome you to our Inside the Inventory webinar. I see people are filtering in now. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and mention where you're calling in from. Today, we'll be discussing data and recommendations related to a regional boundary that we call the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. I'm calling in from Toronto in Treaty 13. I wanted to acknowledge that this land has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Erie, Neutral, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations, Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This land is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. As a settler, I feel it's my responsibility to respect this land and ensure that the work I'm doing to advocate for climate solutions includes Indigenous perspectives. I'll start by telling you a little bit about TAF if you're new to TAF. If you could go to the next slide, please. So TAF is a nonprofit, or the Atmospheric Fund. We're a nonprofit city agency. We work with all levels of government and community stakeholders. We take a variety of approaches to climate solutions. We provide research and grants, investments, and we do programs and demonstration projects. We also do policy development and advocacy. Our mandate is to follow the carbon, and that's why the regional carbon emissions inventory is so foundational to our work. It tracks the sources and trends of greenhouse gas emissions in the region, and it shows us where to focus. And we're always looking for high impact carbon reduction opportunities that are scalable and also help to address other public priorities like affordability, health, resilience, and equity. So we're always happy to hear from you about a project or program that we should be supporting. I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues who will be presenting today. First, we'll hear from Ekaterina Tsakova. She's the lead author of the inventory report, and she leads TAF's research and innovation work. She's calling in today from the West Coast on the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Stolo Nation, Squamish Band, and Musqueam Nation. We're also joined by Akash Harpalani, who leads our clean energy file, and Brian Purcell, who leads TAF's policy work. And we're also lucky enough to have our other two report authors here with us, Miriam Shikarsford and Patrick Ronan. They're on hand for the Q&A. We will save quite a bit of time for the Q&A after the presentations. So feel free to start adding your questions anytime to the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ekaterina.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everybody. This is the 8th year that TAF has released a carbon emissions inventory with, as Julie mentioned, really with the purpose of determining where emissions come from, where are the big sources, and equally important, sharing that information. And we track emissions in 5 sectors. So we got buildings, transportation, industry, waste, and agriculture, and across 6 regions in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Like most inventories, ours includes scope 1 and 2 emissions, but in a number of places, we also report scope 3 emissions, things like estimating embodied carbon of building materials, fugitive methane, and new this year, aviation emissions in Pearson and Billy Bishop. Now, as we go through this inventory, many of the trends show that we are going in the wrong direction, but we'll also highlight places where we do see progress. Our recommendations that Brian will speak to in a few minutes will really emphasize that we know what we need to do to achieve reductions and reverse trends. And the good news is really that there's growing interest in climate mitigation all across the board and a strong sense of urgency. Next slide, please. Now, let's get to the numbers. In 2022, carbon emissions increased by 8% across the GTHA, reaching 54 megatons. The inventory shows that there were increases in all sectors and across all regions. And you can see the spread in each region on the map. And by the way, the numbers that you see here are the total emissions. Per capita emissions also increased across the 6 regions, anywhere from a little over 3% to nearly 11%, with Hamilton having the smallest per capita increase. You can find a lot of the per capita trends and numbers in the region-specific pages of our published inventory. Overall, we're not really quite where emissions were in 2019 pre-pandemic levels, but we are very close. In fact, we're about 98% of the way there. And what's driving the increase that we saw in 2022 is really by and large the buildings and transportation sectors. And these sectors already make up the majority of emissions in the GTHA, over 80% of total emissions. Next slide, please. Here you can see the historic emissions as well as future projections. We have the business as usual, where small efficiency gains somewhat keep up with population increases, and a pathway that gets us to our net zero goals. Other than the progress that we've made during the coal phase-out plan between 2005 and 2015, we continue to see very little progress in reducing emissions since 2015. And to meet our 2030 targets and beyond, we need to decrease emissions, and we need to decrease them by at least 9% per year. And we need to achieve that 9% despite the population growth that we expect to continue to see in the GTHA. Next slide, please. This slide shows the sector breakdowns, and I'm actually going to start by talking about the 3 smallest emission sectors first. Industrial emissions went up by about 5%, and that sector is nearly at pre-pandemic levels. The majority of emissions, industrial emissions, continue to be generated from steel and cement production in plants across Hamilton, Durham, and Peel. Waste and agriculture each increased by 2% in 2022. Waste continues to remain above 2019 levels, as it has over the past few years, while agriculture is nearly at 2019 levels. Next slide, please. Buildings. Building emissions went up by 9.3% and are now at their highest level since 2015, even though 2022 wasn't the coldest year over the last 8 years or so. We actually have surpassed pre-pandemic emissions. Just as a comparison, we're at a little over 24 megatons, and in 2019, the emissions were just a little under 24 megatons. So we've surpassed pre-pandemic emissions. And what's driving this increase is really twofold. On the one hand, you have natural gas that's used for spacing and hot water going up by about 8%. When normalizing for weather, and 2022 was colder than 2021, commercial and industrial weather normalized building emissions went up by 3 to 4%. Interestingly, residential emissions, weather normalized building emissions, actually decreased a little, nearly at 1%. So we are seeing that retrofit and efficiency improvements have a small impact on the residential side. The second reason why total building emissions have gone up is because of the dramatic increase of electricity emissions. Electricity emissions went up by 26% in 2022, and that is largely due to the rise of natural gas-fired generation, which Akash will speak a little bit about in a few minutes. There are a few signs of progress. Looking at the energy and water reporting and benchmarking data, we see that more than a third of large buildings have some reduction in their emission intensity over the last few years. And we're also seeing home retrofit activity increase by 4 times since 2021, largely due to federal incentives. So it shows that programs like this are working. We just need more of them. Next slide, please. Transportation emissions went up by 8.7% in 2022, and that was the highest increase in a single year since 2015. That increase was partly driven by the return to workplaces after the pandemic. And looking at the data trends in 2022, we're not quite at pre-pandemic levels. We're getting very close. We're about 1.5 megatons away, so about 92% of the way there. Some good news. Data shows that in the first half of 2022, emissions increases were largely focused in the first half of 2022, and then they began to level off in the second half of the year. There are other signs of progress. We saw that transit ridership increase by about 58% across the GTHA on average. And that number was even higher in some cities like Brampton, which is great to see. So we're really starting to rise towards pre-pandemic transit ridership numbers. And we also looked at electric vehicle sales. Those increased quite dramatically in 2022 by about 75% on average across the GTHA. Now, EVs still represent a small portion of cars on the road, but the increase in sales is really encouraging, something that we want to continue to see into the future. So with that, I'll pass things on to Akash, who will do a bit of a deep dive on the electricity side.
And I just wanted to add that the chat is enabled. Sorry about that, everyone. Feel free to still introduce yourself and let us know where you're calling in from. Thanks, EK, and take it away, Akash.
Great, thanks, Julia. Thanks for that lead-in, Katrina. So as EK pointed out, electricity emissions have risen again this year. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. By 26% to 2.8 megatons for the region, continuing its upward trend since they bottomed out at 1.1 megatons in 2017. Now, these emissions are really driven by two factors. So first, total consumption, how much electricity is used by residents, businesses, and other institutions in the GTHA. And then secondly, the emissions intensity of the provincial grid. So this recent increase of more than 50% over the last 2 years has been driven by the latter. The grid has become more emissions intensive as a result of us turning up the dial on our gas-fired plants. And that's because these quote unquote peaker plants are running far more often than just the peak, in large part due to the ongoing refurbishments of our nuclear fleet, which will continue over the next decade, and the lack of investment in alternatives to make up that gap. The bigger concern, however, is that our emissions will continue to increase if we stay on our current path. Next slide, please. So just to orient you, this slide reflects provincial emissions. The previous slide reflected GTHA emissions, so that's why these numbers are a little bit larger. But it showcases a similar story, that emissions bottomed out in 2017, but have been steadily rising over the past few years. They were at 6.8 megatons in 2022, which is what's reflected in our carbon inventory. And we're projecting they'll land at about 7.8 megatons in 2023. Now, the concerning part is that the Independent Electricity System Operator, the IESO, is projecting that those emissions will continue to increase to 19.4 megatons out in 2040. And these projections are based on relatively modest increases in demand. They do not reflect the much more ambitious electrification efforts that underpin municipal climate plans across the province. Now, the federal government has released its draft clean electricity regulations with the goal of transitioning Canada to a net zero grid by 2035, which will place limits on how often these gas plants can run. But without course correction, the clean grid advantage that Ontario has enjoyed and claimed, rightfully so, over the past decade will evaporate, especially as most other North American jurisdictions head in the opposite direction in a race to decarbonize their grids. Next slide, please. So what's the good news? Well, we have a number of clean alternatives that can fill this gap. We commissioned some research from experts at the end of last year that modeled a number of scenarios under which Ontario could achieve a net zero grid by 2035. The key takeaway is that it is possible, but we really need to get moving right now on a number of fronts. One piece of this puzzle is that we need investments in non-emitting and low-cost electricity, like wind, like solar, as we electrify our buildings, vehicles, and industries. And the province has signaled that in its next round of procurement, details of which will be coming to the public in the coming months, that set of procurements will be partly focused on that, on procuring new non-emitting low-cost electricity. And TAF will be following those developments closely. But there's an entire toolbox of solutions that are well within the control of municipalities and their local utilities. The first of which is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency initiatives are often the lowest cost option and the lowest hanging fruit. And we really should be pursuing all cost-effective investments in this space to ensure that we're eliminating energy waste from the system. The second is a broader set of tools called distributed energy resources, or DERs. And these really fall into two buckets. The first is local generation. So investing in things like rooftop solar, placing your generation at or close to your electrical loads to limit the need for additional grid capacity, and really taking advantage of the benefits that these resources can provide to local communities. And then the second is demand flexibility. So moving electricity demand off of the peak and really flattening out that load curve. Today, we have access to a number of smart technologies, smart chargers and EV telematics, smart thermostats, and other types of controls, along with battery and thermal storage. So we really should be taking advantage of this full set of resources and making better use of our existing infrastructure. And us at TAF, we have identified DERs as a key resource or key set of resources that really needs to scale here in the GTHA to really bend this curve. Some of you might be aware that we put out a call for grant proposals targeting DER projects earlier this summer. And DERs are going to continue to be a huge focus for us heading into next year as the province continues to develop the enabling policy frameworks. And so this is just an open call. If you have a compelling project idea, or you just want some help in figuring out how your municipality or utility can take full advantage of DERs to meet your local energy needs, please reach out to us. We'd love to chat and figure out how we can help you along that journey. And we really do strongly believe that there is a role for cities and local utilities to play in helping the province address its overall electricity needs, in part because those investments have real benefits. They can reduce or defer investments in electricity generation, transmission, and distribution, and can ensure that electricity is both reliable and affordable. So I'll stop there, and with that, I'll pass it on to Brian to talk about climate supportive policies.
Thanks, Akash. And hello, everybody. I'm going to speak about a few of the climate policy priorities at all levels of government that we're tracking and focusing on that come out of our analysis of the emissions data for the region and the priorities that those suggest. This isn't an exhaustive list, but highlighting a few from each level of government as part of the inventory. And you'll find more detail in the report. So first, at the municipal level, achieving absolute gains in carbon reductions has been difficult for cities in the region, partly because the cities and the region is growing so fast. We're adding about 100,000 plus people to the population every year, building in the neighborhood of 50,000 new homes. And governments at all levels are trying to ramp home construction up. So trying to reduce total emissions while we have this rapid growth going on is very challenging. It's a bit like running on a treadmill. You can work pretty hard and end up staying in the same place or even moving backward, as we saw this year. This is suggests some key priorities for municipalities around managing the carbon emissions that result from growth, and a key to that is building standards. So we've been working for many years with municipalities across the region on green development standards, starting with the Toronto Green Standard we helped to create in 2010, and increasingly partnering with municipalities around the region to set environmental performance standards for new buildings that go up in the region. This is a critical way to manage the carbon emissions from growth, and we need to really rapidly move those standards towards net zero as quickly as possible. We've suggested, net zero by 2030, or net zero ready by 2030 should be the goal in these standards. And of course, it goes beyond just proving the standards. It's really important to make sure that compliance management is well resourced, that staff have the resources and training to review development for its compliance, and also that the industry is assisted in complying so that we're not just making paper gains in performance. And then relatedly, we need to step past just regulating emissions in new buildings and move towards the existing buildings. We're pleased to report that the City of Toronto is the first municipality in Ontario to, or hoping to be the first municipality in Ontario to put in place mandatory emissions performance standards for existing buildings. Earlier this year, City Council in Toronto requested an accelerated timeline for bringing that bylaw by the end of 2024. And took an important step this month in terms of provisionally approving mandatory reporting of emissions. And the idea is you set a emissions intensities target for existing building types, and that gets more strict over time until eventually being net zero ready. This is really key to make predictable and meaningful progress on emissions in buildings. We can't rely entirely on voluntary approaches. It's just not sufficient to make the transformational change that is needed. And also around managing growth and new development, we've really recommended, whether as part of green development standards or as part of parking bylaws, to require all new parking to be EV ready, and to review how much parking is actually required, because in urban areas with good transit access, we sometimes overbuild parking, which has significant embodied carbon emissions. That's a step Toronto's taken. Many other cities are starting to take, put certain percentages, and we encourage everyone to be moving towards 100% EV ready for all new parking as quickly as possible. And at the same time, of course, investing in transit service improvements and electrification. We really need to continue seeing that ridership recovery in public transit. It's trending upward, but for most of the cities, it's below pre-pandemic levels, and we want to get them there as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. On the provincial level, you've heard from Akash how significant the electricity emissions increases have been over the past several years, and how rapidly they're forecasted to increase in the future. So this, again, is making it very difficult to make absolute gains when our electricity emissions are increasing year over year. And that's a key priority in our advocacy to the province, is to turn that situation around, put in place a moratorium on procurement of new natural gas electricity generation as quickly as possible, immediately, ideally, and move instead towards procuring both centralized renewables, large-scale renewables, as well as distributed energy resources as an alternative. And at the same time, we need to work on the demand side by investing in all cost-effective conservation and demand management on the electricity side to minimize how much generation we need. There's enormous potential to target higher levels of energy efficiency in the province, as reflected in the IESO's own studies on conservation potential. The conservation framework is going to be renewed and a new framework created this year, or in the next year, I should say. And so we're encouraging the province to really dial up conservation and really target all cost-effective conservation and demand management. We also want to see improvements to the Ontario Building Code. The Ontario Building Code energy efficiency levels have been frozen at the same place since 2017. In fact, the last update was to remove EV readiness requirements from the building code. And the current draft proposal for the next update maintains the same efficiency standards we've had in place for since 2017. So really, it'd be a lost decade if that's the direction we take. More than a decade on energy efficiency and new construction in terms of the provincial building code. And we need a higher level of ambition to backstop what municipalities are doing around green development standards. Next slide, please. And at the federal level, some important work underway that it's really important to bring to a conclusion and maintain the rigor. So first, as Akash mentioned, the clean electricity regulations. These have been released in draft form, and will set limits on the use of natural gas fired generation beginning in 2035. Now, that's still a ways away, so provincial action in the interim is still really important, but it sort of sets a date where we'll have to begin the transition away from fossil generation, and really puts a cap on how much fossil generation can be done post 2035. A critical regulation, and we're encouraging the federal government to move forward with it and maintain the rigor in the draft regulation. And on buildings, we want to see the federal government moving forward with the use of equipment efficiency regulations to restrict the use of the sale of gas-fired heating equipment. The best practice internationally is to set clear timelines in regulation to remove gas-fired heating equipment and hot water equipment from the market. And you need to announce those well in advance to give industry time to prepare. And so that's something that's within the federal government's power, and we're encouraging them to get started on next year in a meaningful way. And on the transportation side, very exciting, the federal government has introduced a draft of a zero emissions vehicle sales mandate for light duty vehicles that will require a transition away from the sale of internal combustion engines and putting an end to it by 2035. That's very promising, with huge impacts for both carbon emissions and air quality in the GTHA. In fact, the public health benefits of this regulation could be even more significant than the carbon reduction, with billions in health benefits from avoided air pollution. So we want to see that moving forward, again, maintaining the rigor that's been drafted in the draft regulations. And the next step then is a sales mandate for medium and heavy duty vehicles, which is just in the initial design phase at the federal level. And we're encouraging them to move quickly towards a strong standard to put in place a sales mandate for medium and heavy duty. And finally, we need the continuing federal investment in the charging infrastructure that enables these sales mandates to be successful. And a key priority for our region is investing more in EV readiness in existing multi-residential buildings, where it can be quite a barrier for people to adopt electric vehicles. And the last thing I wanted to say is just that our team is working on all of these and more priorities at all levels of government. So for any of you on the webinar who are working on some of these or interested to work on it, whether it's municipalities looking at their own policies and programs or other organizations, our team is available and at your disposal to advise and coordinate on policy advocacy for key climate policies. And we encourage you to reach out and find out how we can work together. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Julie.
Awesome, thanks, Brian. And we can welcome back all the panelists now for the Q&A. You can turn your cams back on. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, but we got some really great questions through the registration as well. So if you're nervous about the number of questions in the Q&A, we have a lot from your really great questions in the registration. So I can go there, but it's also not too late to add your question here. The first question I wanted to ask EK is a question that we get a lot about our building data and other data in the inventory. Is it possible to see a further breakdown of data, for example, by zone within a region or by building type?
Thanks, Julie. Good question. So the data that we get, and John, specific to your question, the data that we get on buildings, both natural gas and electricity, is already broken down by class type. So we have residential, commercial, and industrial buildings. And we receive aggregated postal code data, so at the FSA level. That groups usually a number of buildings together in close proximity to one another. Beyond that, we don't, because of confidentiality issues, we don't expect to see individual building data being reported by utilities. But you do have EWRB, energy and water reporting that, over the upcoming years will capture more and more buildings. So that is something that we can look towards for individual kind of building trends where, what are energy and carbon emissions looking like across a variety of buildings and regions as well. So both of those we can draw on both of those sources, and we'll continue to look towards EWRB to see what kind of trends we can extract from there. But purely from the utility side, it's going to be, it's difficult to get it at the individual building level.
Great. And you mentioned building codes, Ekaterina, and we have a couple of questions that came through the registration about the impact of building codes. The first one was about Toronto Green Standard, but I think we could extend it to the other municipalities in the region that have green development standards. They might be a bit newer. But could you tell us about the impact of those standards since, TGS is from 2010. Maybe Brian, this question is for you. Are we seeing any progress or impacts of those green standards?
Absolutely, we are. So yeah, Toronto's had a green standard in place since 2010 with multiple updates onto version 4 right now, and version 5 is coming in 2025. The intent with Toronto, the current schedule is to move to a net zero ready design requirement by 2028 with version 6 of the Toronto Green Standard. We've definitely seen a significant change in the industry in terms of the development and the energy efficiency in new construction. It's not moving as fast as we would all like to see, and there's remains significant gaps between how buildings are designed to perform and how they perform in actuality. But we're seeing major changes, and it's also driven greater interest in alternative energy systems such as district energy and ground source heat exchange. Major uptick in participation in that in Toronto. Which the industry tells me it has been, a direct outcome of the Toronto Green Standard, and we're seeing those impacts as well in other cities with green standards, although some of them are a bit newer into introduction. And it takes a few years because green standards are sort of applied at the time of typically site plan approval, planning approvals, and that means like the buildings that are sort of meeting today's green standard aren't actually going to be constructed for 3-4 years in many cases, because there's a big time lag between planning approvals and opening up a building for occupancy. So it takes some time to see the impact of the green standards and the updates, but we definitely see that having an impact.
So the municipal green standards can be applied by municipalities. Looking at the Ontario Building Code, we had a question about the relationship between Ontario Building Code and the creating a grid to sufficiently prepare for electrification, so heat pumps, electric vehicles. What's the relationship between updates we need to see in the building code and the future grid that we want to see? And maybe that question for Brian or Akash, maybe both.
Sure, I'll start. And well, several key priorities on the code. One, we do want to see electric vehicle readiness back in the Ontario Building Code. It's just the most cost-effective time to prepare buildings for EV charging, where there is parking going in, is at the time of construction. And that also offers the opportunity to do strategic things like demand management of that charging if it's planned at a building level rather than on individual occupant requests. And that can let us use these batteries as like a grid management tool with smart charging and eventually bi-directional charging as well. And also just energy efficiency in the building code is always helpful. It backstops green standards and replaces them in jurisdictions that don't have it. And there's stronger enforcement of building codes, which is a key benefit of them. And so, yeah, just, dialing up the energy efficiency requirements and starting to eventually in the future look at things like solar ready or demand response ready requirements to mitigate the impact on the grid of electrification.
Yeah, nothing to add there. That's a great answer.
Sorry, I have a child, sick child at home who just got taken out of the room. So sorry for that break. The next question I have is from one of our live questions from Jade Schofield. So Jade asks, a lot of the recommendations about decarbonization sit with higher levels of government, where the elimination is deeply reliant on politics that tend to swing every 4 years. What can we do to secure more long-term momentum in the right direction? I know that's a really hard question, but starting to think this through, and we're certainly thinking about it a lot at TAF. Brian, did you want to share your thoughts about that?
Sure. Really challenging question that we think about a lot. Really what we'd like to see is what we started to see in some countries internationally is making climate a non-partisan issue, so that the different parties really are aligned on where we need to go, while they may and just have different strategies and opinions about the best policies and programs to get us to that net zero future. We're not quite there yet in Canada, and I think, there's no magic recipe to doing that, but one of the things we're doing and encouraging others to do is to really intentionally design climate policies and programs to create multiple benefits for the community. economic benefits, health benefits, and equity and accessibility benefits, so that we kind of broaden the constituency of people who have an interest in seeing these climate solutions brought forward, and demonstrate to people that this is not just about reducing emissions, but these same changes are going to, improve our quality of life in other ways. So we think that's kind of important to making durable gains at all levels of government.
Great.
And maybe just to add
yeah.
to that, Julie, to Brian's response, this multiple benefits part is not necessarily reflected in this inventory, right? This inventory looks at the carbon. Where's the carbon coming from? But things just, things like the health benefit side, both on the transportation and buildings, which are our two biggest sectors that we need to deal with, are quite significant. And you can look at reducing emissions on paper of a building, but looking at how you're improving resiliency to extreme heat events, which is becoming more and more prevalent, addressing thermal comfort issues, addressing ventilation, creating a better environment for occupants. All of those things are part of that co-benefits, multiple benefits package. That is not necessarily what we see in the inventory, what we see on paper, but are just absolutely critical for impacting our way of life and impacting everybody's way of life, whether we are at home, at work, or traveling.
Yeah, and even to add a communications and engagement note to that question as well, I think that civic engagement, public engagement is so important. Many of the folks here on the call today are citizens who are volunteers or working with NGOs. I think it's really important for the various groups to work together to see the impacts of these of climate and the potential solutions. We need to deeply listen and have the patience to multi-solve these kind of wicked problems to build that long-term understanding and hopefully inevitably support. So yeah, thanks for that great question, Jade. I love this next question from Janice Fuser. The question is about how to support municipalities in increasing transit service. We saw transit ridership increase this year, but it still hasn't quite rebounded in some municipalities since the pandemic. What do you think could help increase service, bring back ridership? Anyone on the panel want to take that one?
Well, one thing is really key is to maintain or enhance service levels. So there's pressure inevitably when ridership goes down, for example, during a pandemic, to reduce service levels because you have underused capacity on the system. But of course, that initiates what some people call this transit death spiral, where you reduce service levels and fewer people find it less convenient. They have to wait longer, and so they're more encouraged to move away from transit. So we have to kind of put a break there on that and just have that confidence and commitment that we have to bring back transit to pre-pandemic levels and beyond. And so that requires, just taking a hit for a few years where we maintain or enhance service levels, even in the face of reduced ridership, to draw riders back to the system. That's really critical because, people are looking for that convenience, that safety, that comfort on the transit system to make it a compelling and attractive option. And, that's really key to boosting growth. And that's in the short term really about that existing transit service levels, because of course we know new transit projects take many years to complete and aren't a short-term solution, but we can immediately, in many cases, improve service levels.
And always take an opportunity to bring in some numbers, but there are, regions are getting quite close to pre-pandemic transit ridership numbers, and mentioned Brampton as being one that's actually surpassed 2019 numbers. They're about 1.5 times the number of ridership they saw in 2019. So we're definitely getting to those high numbers and surpassing them in some cases, which is great to see. But once again, we need to make sure we deal with that and we continue to support that in the future. Great.
Our next question comes from Nick Schroeder. maybe Akash, this question might be for you about the forthcoming tax credits for low carbon technologies. What impact do you think this will have on, well, building emissions and also electricity emissions?
Yeah, so we can look to the United States, which rolled out something similar a couple of years prior to Canada's announcement, and we've seen it have a significant impact in the investment and rollout of renewable technologies to support the electricity grid. And we're also seeing subsequent investments in other types of technologies that really support decarbonization of our building stock. We're still waiting to see the exact practical details of the Canadian version of the investment tax credits. So those details really do matter in terms of the ease of implementation. But obviously to us, I think there's significant potential to really help bend the curve here. And we'll wait with bated breath to see what the actual details look like.
This question comes from someone in Toronto, but I think it's relevant across the region. The question is, how can those who live in Toronto or other municipalities use the inventory to advocate for funding climate action in the upcoming budget consultations? Brian?
Sure. Well, I encourage people to draw on the inventory and feel free to quote or reference it if you're preparing, written or in-person submissions to your city government around their budget or anything else, and to highlight basically just key trends that they can absorb. That emissions overall in the region are going up, including for those municipal levels we cover in the inventory. That emissions for those specific sources are trending up. We do find that many councillors are really not aware of the emissions trend or may believe that their municipality is doing really well on climate and be surprised sometimes even to find out that emissions are trending up in certain areas or overall in this case. So I think that's an important thing to bring to their attention in the context of then going on to your specific recommendations. And of course, if our policy recommendations that we put in the inventory or elsewhere align with your submission, then referencing our reports, including the inventory, can be helpful there as well to add some evidence or whatnot to your submission. I think those are some key ways, or even just attaching it. If you're sending material to a councillor or your mayor, attaching the inventory and referencing it can be another good way to just show that you're drawing on evidence to underline your concerns and your recommendations.
Great. So here's another question that came in through registration. You talked a little bit about focusing on progress, Ekaterina, at the beginning of the presentation. This question is about Ontario as a province and their progress. Could you mention some things that Ontario has done to make progress on decarbonization over the last year?
Sure, Julie. We talked a little bit about codes. Although they're not where we want them to be, we do see some progress in updates. We really have to focus there on making sure that updates are done regularly, they're not delayed. There also is more on the federal level looking at introducing GHGs and carbon emissions as part of the code, which is going to be really important at ensuring that new construction of buildings is progressing in a way that we're really focusing on the carbon piece and reducing it. We're looking at envelope and mechanical systems that will get us there. On the transportation side, the EV sales that we're seeing, trends we're seeing in the inventory pretty much across the board, the GTHA is quite encouraging. Installation of chargers is definitely something that is a positive trend that we're going to continue to do more of and accelerate if we want to see EV vehicles continue to increase in purchases and ensure that we meet our federal 2030 and beyond targets. So I would say those two things are really quite key. At the same time, as Akash mentioned, on the electricity grid, that's going to be the really big focus going forward. And we really need to look at reducing the amount of natural gas-fired generation, because that is one of the fastest growing emission sources that we're seeing in inventory. So looking forward, that is something that we really need to see progress, and in some cases, reversal of trends, really stopping the amount of natural gas that is injected in the electricity grid.
I'll just add one thing.
Oh, go ahead, Akash.
No, I was going to say the other piece that is encouraging is that a number of the low carbon alternatives to currently fossil fuel intensive end uses are dropping in price year over year. And so the business case is becoming more clear cut every year. And so that's partly what's driving this trend in adoption of low carbon technologies across the world. And so that's an encouraging sign, and hopefully that trend will continue.
Yeah, I'll just add that the two most concrete things that I've seen the province do in the last year or so to support climate action. Two things. One is they've moved forward on sort of a very large procurement of energy storage, which is, really puts Ontario at the forefront in North America of energy storage as we move forward. A lot of those projects, more than half of them, also have 50% or greater Indigenous ownership. So generating local economic opportunities and benefits for Indigenous communities, which is fantastic and very encouraging. At the same time, the province is also looking to build a lot of new natural gas generation. So that's a concern, but the storage investments will benefit us for a long time to come. And the other thing was last year, boosting the investment in conservation. So when the current government or current party was first elected, they cut back electricity conservation and demand management by about 50%. But last year, they kind of restored the budget to more or less the previous levels that we saw back in 2017. And that was encouraging. It's still well below what the IESO's own studies say that all cost-effective conservation that's out there that would benefit the system. So we'd like to see another, basically doubling again in the new framework. But it shows that they're recognizing the value that conservation and demand management provides to the system in terms of avoiding the need for new generation and limiting the use of fossil gas power. So yeah, some credit there on those two files is deserved.
One clarification request from John Stevenson. You mentioned earlier, Brian, in the recommendations to ban gas burning equipment, and we've seen some progress there at the municipal level. I believe Kelowna, BC, and Montreal has banned new gas hookups. Could there be? The question is, do you think there could be any wheels on the idea of a federal clean heat regulation under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, similar to the clean electricity regulations? So, a federal policy rather than waiting for municipalities to do them one at a time.
So possibly. So I was highlighting the use of equipment performance standards using Canada's Energy Efficiency Act, which can phase out the sale of gas burning equipment. And that is a good model and which we encourage the government to use. There has been some discussion in recent years about that other regulatory mechanisms, such as the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, could provide another way of doing this that could be more flexible. For example, because the CEPA regulates, facilities rather than sale of product. It gives you the option of putting in place requirements for that apply to the existing installations, not just on time of sale, so it can be faster. It also gives you more flexibility to have regional specific requirements, or distinguish between new construction and existing buildings to allow certain segments to go faster, because again, CEPA is a facilities-based type regulation. So that's something that's interesting. We're just learning about, and certainly would encourage further exploration and movement on, especially if it lets us get to federal action on gas heating regulations faster. So yeah, definitely aware of and interested to learn more about that as an alternative or complementary approach.
One more question on the federal regulation is coming from Harry French about the Canada Building Strategy, which is delayed. Any insights on how that strategy might impact building emissions, or any insights on when that will be updated?
Yeah, we're expecting to see the federal green building strategy come out sometime within the next, I would say, 3 to 4 months. We don't know with any certainty, but it has been delayed, and well, we expect to see it either late this year or early next year. We don't have any special insight as to what's in there beyond, what's been sort of consulted on as ideas. But based on that, we do think there will be some commitment in some form in there to use federal regulations to limit the use of natural gas and other fossil fuels for heating. So that might not be specific about the regulatory means. Hopefully there'll be some specificity about timelines, and it will give some direction to staff to start working on the regulations, whichever authorities they lean on to do so. That's probably going to be the biggest thing that we'll see in the Canada Green Building Strategy. But it may also be an opportunity to extend or grow certain programs like the Greener Homes Grant, as we flagged that in the forward to the inventory, that there's growing concern that the Canada Greener Homes Grant is running through its budget and may need to stop accepting new applicants early next year. There's been widespread media coverage of this now. It's causing quite a bit of concern, both for potential applicants, but also for the energy efficiency industry, which has scaled up to meet the growing demand for home retrofits that program has created. So we're hoping that either through the Canada Green Building Strategy or separately before that, the federal government can make clear its intent to extend and recapitalize the Canada Greener Homes program, potentially improving or strengthening it as well. But at minimum, extending that, because we can't afford to have a stop-start boom and bust cycle in home energy retrofits. We need to just continue dialing them up each and every year until we reach net zero. There's no time to sort of hit pause while we'll wait a few years for the budget situation to improve.
Yeah, I think we have another question from Sue McKenzie, just following up on the building strategy. She mentions low upfront carbon, I think embodied carbon. Is there discussion about including embodied carbon in for building materials in the Canadian it's Canadian building standards, maybe the national code or the building strategy?
So the federal government has announced its intent to address embodied carbon from building construction materials and processes in the 2030 edition of the National Model Codes, and then it would trickle through to provincial building codes at sometime after 2030. That's kind of disappointingly slow in our minds, given how significant the embodied emissions from construction are. And so we've certainly encouraged cities to look at either mandatory or voluntary requirements in the green building standards. Some, often introduced as a voluntary element and can transition to mandatory. Because 2030 is a long time to wait for it to show up in the national code, when you consider that there's still like a 18-month lag at least before that comes through into provincial codes. But it is under development, and that's encouraging to see some commitment there.
I think we can get to one more question. This one for Akash, a really great question again from Jay Schofield. Hi, Jane. Great to see you. This question is about the challenge of natural gas in rural areas. So natural gas being a cleaner source than oil, it's still a major fuel source in rural areas of the GTHA. What do you think about action for rural residents where grid reliability is less stable, electricity is very expensive? Akash, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you're absolutely right that the grid reliability experienced by many rural residents is quite a bit lower than those in urban areas. But it really does highlight the opportunity of distributed energy resources to really meet that need and increase the reliability of electricity for those residents. You can install rooftop solar or some other form of local generation to either serve as your primary source of electricity or as backup generation if it's paired with battery. And that can really enable those residents to limit the amount of time that they're without access to electricity, which we know is a real problem right now. And so that also just speaks to the need for the incentives that underpin some of these programs to really be targeted at the areas where they can provide the most benefit. Great question. Thanks for that.
I'll just add one point to that, because this comes up a lot. There's sometimes a misperception that like having, let's say, gas heating can allow you to continue to heat your home through a power failure, which is, as a general rule, in 99% of cases, not the case. Gas heating systems require electricity to function, and will shut off automatically during a power failure. There are a few, that could do that, special equipment, or if you're using a backup generator, of course, but that could also power a heat pump based system. So, just important to recognize too that like just putting people on gas heating isn't going to make them more resilient in the face of power outages. Their heat will go down the same as it would with an electric heat pump or any other heating system.
Great. Yeah, great question. So much was covered today. Thank you very much for these thoughtful questions. If you still have remaining questions, we are really committed to getting back to you. So if your question wasn't answered from registration, Mirha, if you could pull up the contact slide, that would be great. Just so you can get in touch with these presenters. You can also reach out to me at any time. We'd love to hear from you for your input or feedback on today's presentation. We're going to put a lightning fast survey question into the chat. It takes like under 30 seconds, but really helps us. We're eager to collaborate with you to make these solutions happen faster and bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions in the region. The first step is getting to know the data. So we're partway there. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the behind the scenes helpers, Mirha Syed, Mariam Shakarsford, and Pat Ronan. Thanks so much to our presenters as well, and for all of you for the great questions. So we'll give you one more minute for your lunch before your 1 o'clock meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.